What's going on, everyone? It's Mr. West. I hope we're all well. So welcome back to another ultimate video test, and this time it's for the OnePlus 7 Pro in low light conditions. So as with all ultimate video tests, I'll leave all of the main camera specifications down in the description, and I'll just run through some of the high level features throughout the video to help save you some time. So the front facing camera is a 16 megapixel fixed focus camera. It records video at up to 1080p at 30 frames per second. It has mono audio recording versus the stereo audio from the rear cameras. And it's helped along with electronic image stabilization. Now historically, electronic image stabilization on phones doesn't fare too well in low light. It can sometimes make the edges of buildings, like this cottage behind me, and also the grass, it can render them a little bit fuzzy and a little bit noisy as the edges of the image that are cropped out help to keep the frame on the straight and narrow. The front-facing camera video on the OnePlus 7 Pro is actually really good during daylight, and I just wanted to see what it's like in low light conditions. Now, as we're approaching summertime, it gets darker a lot later, so it's that kind of difficult, not quite dark and not quite light kind of light, if you know what I mean. So even though we've got some street lighting, we've still got a little bit of detail in the background. Now, the clouds behind me, they're not actually that bright. The phone is obviously upping the exposure to help dig out some detail in those clouds thanks to the auto HDR function. And if I look behind me into the fields behind me, we can still get a little bit of detail. Where is it? In this cottage here, we can just about make out the paint on the side of that and some lighting around it as well. So just go back a bit and we'll check out street lighting. So funny how different phones react to lens flare. Some have a kind of like a flower pattern where there's like big beams of light and kind of a flower effect, whereas the OnePlus 7 Pro has a more starbursty effect and kind of get a cool lens flare effect at the same time as well. So let me know what the sound quality is like. We've got a little bit of wind pickup and also got these passing vehicles just off to my left. So let's just check out the image stabilization at dusk with a quick run. Let's go into much darker, almost complete black light with just a little bit of ambient street light, and you can see it's getting a lot darker and my face is far less exposed now. So if I turn around, you can see behind me there it's almost completely dark, even though we've still got a bit of contrast and light from the sky. These are quite challenging conditions for this smallish sensor. So that is the front facing camera at 1080p at 30 frames per second. I'll switch to the rear cameras now and show you how they cope. Okay, so starting where we left off then. This is 1080p at 30 frames per second. And the rule of thumb with rear camera video is 30 frames per second is supported with electronic image stabilization, and 60 frames per second modes default back to optical image stabilization from the main sensor. So coming into a little bit more light now. The rear camera is recording stereo sound, and the stereo sound is a much improved version of what we had on the OnePlus 6T, so a good chance to check out exposure now with the car lights. Do get a little bit of glare back into the camera lens. Okay, so let's check out lens flare from street lighting. Yeah, so kind of a more bursty effect even though the light is completely blown out. If I just touch the sensor for exposure compensation, even if I drag down, so we can see the shape of the light now, but we lose the exposure on most of the image. So I just tap to go back, that is auto exposure. Now you let me know what you think of the image stabilization and how that affects the overall image. Now you can use the zoom function. Now in lower light the phone decides how it uses the telephoto lens, and usually it will default to the main sensor and do a digital crop and then just apply some processing to get a sharper image. You do get image stabilization in this mode, however slight movements are more exaggerated, as with most cameras when they are zoomed in. So let's check out image stabilization at 1080-30 with a quick run. Well, we've got good light, autofocus, really fast and accurate even with lower light. Now we do have some ambient lighting to help us along, so if I move to an area where there's not so much light surrounding the sensor and helping it along. Let's try again. Yep, a little bit slower to recognize the object, but it does it, and that is cool. Excellent. Okay, so switching now to 1080p at 60 frames per second. You will notice a large drop off in exposure, so double the frames equals half the exposure, especially in lower light. And this is using optical image stabilization, but you do get nice fluid, smooth movement in this mode. The way the phone behaves is exactly the same with things like lens flare, but you do get lower overall exposure in this mode. Now you can use the third-party application to increase the exposure, but this is using the stock application. And if I go for a quick run, you'll see the differences between the electronic and optical stabilization. A little bit more shakier, and I have noticed, having looked at my daylight video test, there are some jello effects at 60 frames per second with no electronic stabilization. Okay, so 4K 30 FPS then, we'll just touch on this very briefly. May or may not be able to see a difference in the quality, depending on what kind of monitor you're looking through. But generally in low light, the electronic image stabilization will kind of make things a little bit blurry as the light starts to fall. And once again, if I go to 3 times, now this is likely using digital zoom instead of the telephoto lens, because obviously it cannot cope with the light, so it uses the main sensor and crops in. Stabilization is still good, and if I keep still, you just let the phone come to rest. The focus is pretty good. You can go more than this, up to 10 times zoom, although you do lose clarity in the image even though it's still stabilized. So back to just the standard lens. And finally 4K at 60 frames per second. Just a quick reminder from the daylight test that at 4K 30 and 4K 60 you can record for 10 minutes and 5 minutes maximum consecutively. So even though the phone is using the Snapdragon 855 chip, you still got that limitation. I have noticed when recording at 4K 60 the phone does heat up quite a lot, so perhaps that's to just protect the hardware. Maybe they can increase that with a future software update. But the phone behaves exactly the same as far as stabilization, lens flare and exposure and fluidity of movement goes, whether it's 1080 60 or 4K 60. Couple of drop frames just now and again. Just look out into the sky, kind of a blue tint. I'm seeing more grey sky with the naked eye, but kind of a blue tint with this. And you know, to the naked eye I can see more than what obviously the phone can. But in well lit areas the video does look pretty good indeed. Okay, so now testing wide angle video, 1080p at 30 frames per second. Now this is an experimental feature which can be unlocked under a secret sequence from the phone dialer. This is obviously not quite final software ready. You can see the image is quite grainy. Lots of wide angle lenses don't do very well in low light. That includes things like Samsung and Huawei handsets, so the OnePlus 7 Pro is not alone. And also this video is stabilized. It looks pretty horrific in this experimental menu, purely for the basis that it's not finished and it doesn't have anything like OIS or electronic image stabilization. So we'll just turn around. Let's go back this way. So we can see, even with a little bit of light left in the sky and some street lighting, it's still very, very grainy. But it's nice to have the option of the wide angle video. And when it's stabilized, it does look really good. So I really hope that OnePlus does bring us a software update that we're all hoping for later on down the line, maybe in a few weeks or so, which adds this option, and also things like nightscape on the additional lenses for the still camera. But for now, we've got this experimental menu. I'll link the video that I made about this on screen now, and that tells you how to get this function. It does work well in daylight, as you can imagine, but as you can see in low light, there is a hell of a lot of grain in the image. But for those who are interested, that is how wide angle video looks at 1080p 30 fps. You can't go any higher in low light situations. Okay, so that is it. That's the... Alright, so to finish off the video, a little bonus for you. This is 4K at 30 frames per second from the front-facing camera on the OnePlus 7 Pro, and this is using the Filmic Pro app. So this has been stabilized with a gimbal. And as I suspected, the OnePlus 7 Pro is basically taking a 4K image and then using that image to crop in and get that really cool electronic image stabilization that you see from the front-facing camera at 1080p at 30 frames per second. But using Filmic Pro removes the electronic image stabilization crop and basically allows you to see exactly what the front camera can do, which is 4K at 30 frames per second. Now, it's not really doing it justice in the dark. I will do a test during daytime, and also I'm waiting for Filmic Pro to update their app to include all support for all the different lenses on the OnePlus 7 Pro. But for now, this is it. That is all the modes plus a few bonuses for the OnePlus 7 Pro. You let me know what you think in the comments. And if you've got any questions, then please let me know and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. But for now, this has been the ultimate video test for the OnePlus 7 Pro. My name is Mr. West, and I'll catch you guys later.